No problem. Thank you, Yolanda. So hopefully everyone can see my slides. I'm really looking forward to this conversation today. And I'm going to start off, as Yolanda said, by running us through some recent research. Got a few topics to cover today. So going to start off by having a look at cities, then focus in on what that's meant for, or what some of the recent trends we've seen has meant for real estate investment trends. And then finally, just have a focus on residential as an asset class as a final topic this afternoon. So starting with cities and starting with the question that has been asked throughout the year and has been the topic of headlines, numerous speculation, people asking, is the city now dead? And I want to start this presentation off by saying, no, this is not the death of the city, just to get that point out of the way as quickly as possible. So, cities have evolved, cities are resilient, and they have sort of evolved to be as they are for a reason. It's important to remember that their death has been predicted before. So we have had numerous cases where people are saying it's been the death of the city. Perhaps most recently, we've seen 9/11, where people said New York was dead, no one would work in a high-rise building again. Of course, that turned out to not be the case. And we have to remember, after COVID, the draws of cities, what makes cities attractive will still be there. That heritage, the culture, the entertainment, that buzzy environment, and that will continue to draw people into cities. Now, while saying this, that's not to say that we haven't seen changes in people's behaviours and desires because of the pandemic. And we have seen a number of trends that we were beginning to see before COVID accelerated, and actually a number of new trends being introduced altogether. So a good example of this is the housing market, which is worth a closer look in itself because there's been an absolutely remarkable recovery. House prices in October rose 0.8% according to Nationwide, and you can see that on the green bars on this chart, and that takes UK annual growth to 5.8%, which is the highest level it's been since January 2015. So huge levels of house price growth. But then the surge in activity is now past its peak, which you can see from the blue line of new buyer inquiries, which peaked in July. In terms of transactions, new sales agreed in October are fewer than in the summer, but they're still 50% higher than the same period last year. And this is beginning to translate into completed transactions. But in terms of transactions, what's actually a more interesting trend is where the transactions are taking place. Before we have a look at that data, I want to try and help you understand how buyer preferences have changed. A story I'm sure you're all familiar with, but I think it's always helpful to back this up with some stats. So in the summer, Savills did a survey of over 500 buyers, and these are some of the key results that we found. So first of all, 74% said the experience of COVID had caused them to reassess their work-life balance, and 39% of those people significantly so. 62% said the amount of outside space or garden had become more important, and 48% said village locations are more attractive, and slightly higher number for those with school-aged children. So with that in mind, having a look here, it's perhaps not surprising to see the geographical spread of deal activity. So it's not just people saying they'd like more space and like to move outside of cities. Transactions at a local level actually demonstrate that this trend is happening. So this map is looking at transactions in September compared to the same period last year. And essentially, the darker the orange, the higher the increase in transactions. And I think that box out of London and the home counties in South East really show this story coming through. So really strong transaction numbers in the home counties, although it is worth noting that practically everywhere on this map is seeing higher transactions than they were seeing in 2019. So in terms of how long this trend lasts, that remains to be seen. But I think it's also worth remembering that this trend comes after more than a decade of people focusing on cities and urban areas over more rural locations. One of the key drivers of this trend, as well as that desire for green space, is flexible working. And many people have been enjoying this over the year and can see it continuing further ahead. So we've done a different survey at Savills, this time of office workers. And you can see here how many days a week they were working from home before lockdown and how many days a week they anticipate working from home after lockdown. So after COVID has gone away, and there's definitely a worker swing towards more days at home in the future, although not all. It's also worth pointing out how much for say the workers will have, especially in a recession, is also a consideration. But ultimately, I believe we're going to end up with this hybrid of home working and office working. So what about those days in the office? What will employees actually be doing? Perhaps instead of going into meetings and being interrupted, as one quote here might put it. Our survey also highlights this. So this is looking at what people felt different types of work would be best to do in the office or at home. And it's really not that surprising. Group work, meetings, networking, they're all better for office. Reading documents, taking calls, that's better for home. It's not surprising things. And that the workplace and the office has this important role for collaboration, creativity. It's also so important for younger employees to be able to learn and for new starters to be able to understand the company. So that's some of the shorter term trends. But if we return to cities, it's also worth noting that on a per capita basis, cities produce less carbon than rural locations due to a number of factors: density, less reliance on cars, the ability to do big decarbonising projects on scale. So this is a really key point that I want to make. Cities are the most sustainable place to live, work and enjoy. And actually, if we have a look at some data from the UN and look at the proportion of people expected to live in urban areas at a global level, this has been increasing. It's forecast to continue increasing. And as well as that sort of sustainability benefit from cities, urbanization also goes hand in hand with higher incomes, increased productivity, and a number of other benefits there. But if this urbanization is continuing, the next point to address is that cities need to be allowed to grow, partly to make the most of their sustainability advantages. And in some cases, this could include expansion into the green belt. And there's scope for green belt land to be used more creatively to meet the goals of the planning system. One potential benefit is it would actually also give greater public access to the Greenbelt land, the so-called Greenbelt compensation, and this will help address some of the COVID-related concerns about city dwellers having access to green spaces. It's also worth noting that the type of cities people move to might change. And again, this is something that we were seeing before the pandemic. So what we've done for this analysis is have a look at cities in Europe with a GDP greater than 50 billion and had a look at their net migration over the past 5 years and shown it on this chart as a share of their 2020 population. And this is the top 10 cities in Europe with the highest migration over the past 5 years. And if you have a look at those cities, they're typically smaller, vibrant, there's a number of strong tech scenes, higher quality of life, cities there. Compare that to the list of the bottom 10 cities in Europe. And remember that this is trends from before the pandemic. So we're looking over the past 5 years. Actually, it's large cities like Paris and London are on that list. So we were already seeing a trend of smaller cities with good job opportunities, vibrant lifestyles, attracting sort of mobile, well-educated millennials. And I think it's important to remember that for these smaller cities as well as the larger cities, the need to keep up with the growing demand for real estate and infrastructure. As a city grows, the ability to accommodate new arrivals is critical, and that includes providing suitable housing, office space, ensuring there's sufficient infrastructure, and many more things. Now, thinking about that structure of cities and providing the right infrastructure, there's also a number of trends that COVID has been accelerating around city layouts. So the first one is what's been come to be known in some places as the slow streets movement, as cities around the world have been introducing these measures to encourage and enable more walking and cycling. And again, this was happening before, but it's happened even more so since the pandemic. And a lot of the changes that were made were intended to be temporary, but actually they're now being made permanent, which is a really positive trend. At the moment, very few cities give pedestrians priority. So to create cities with fewer cars, less reliant on public transport, these layouts, as I said, need looking at. So neighbourhoods need to meet the most of people's daily needs within just a walk or cycle. And this is a concept that's become known as this 15-minute cities. It's definitely not new. We've seen proposals and plans being enacted in Portland in the US, Melbourne in Australia, and Paris already. And it's a concept that's proving to be more and more popular, particularly with COVID. And then the final point here to make, though, is that these things do take time. And what worries me is that people are avoiding public transport, and car usage is now back to pre-pandemic levels in many locations across the UK. And that really illustrates the challenges that we face. So that's my sort of a quick run through on cities, and I'm sure we can have a much longer conversation about that in the discussion after this. There's so many trends to unpack there and think about, and of course I've come at this from a sort of quite a UK, Europe, US way of looking at things, and we must remember that in Asia and other locations around the world, it's a very different situation, very different set of drivers. So it's definitely not going to be a one size fits all trend that we see. There will be a lot of variation. I want to move on now and have a look at real estate investment trends, because have these trends that we've just seen been influencing what real estate investors are doing? I think it gives us a good indication of the market. And I'm going to start off big, about as big as it gets in terms of global real estate investment, and have a look at all investment globally. So you can see here total investment volume that's happening around the world into real estate. And really interestingly, 2019 was actually a record year. Having started off the year quite slowly in Q1, you can see that it finished very strongly with a huge Q2, a lot of investment going into real estate during that quarter. And that strong activity continued into the first quarter of this year. Of course, what you can see is it slowed down, and Q2 and Q3 is where you can really see the impact of the pandemic coming through, as those investment volumes have slowed quite significantly. That's a big global picture. What I think is potentially more interesting is when we break it down and have a look at it by asset class, because you can really get an indication of what's going on in different sectors. So this is having a look. The green bars is just showing you total investment volume, so you can get an idea of the relative volumes compared to the different sectors. And then the purple dot is showing how the investment volume this year compares to that of the same period last year. First thing to point out, every sector has been impacted by the pandemic. There has been no sector that has escaped unscathed with this with the pandemic here. Of course, when you have a look at this, industrial and apartments, and I should say apartment is an institutional investment into residential, so buy to let or multifamily rather than an individual house, have really been the sectors that have been least affected. You can see on here retail being quite severely hit, hotel, office perhaps unsurprisingly, and we can also have a look at cross-border investment, so investors buying in other countries to their own. This accounts for around a quarter of all investment activity, and here they even more so buy into that beds and sheds, so apartment and industrial investment strategy that we're seeing at the moment. So for the last section of the presentation, I just want to spend a few minutes talking about the institutional investment into the residential sector. But before having a look at detail on that sector, I just want to start off by having a look at unemployment around the world. So starting off in the US, the effects of COVID here were felt fastest. You can see it's very reactive, a huge rise in unemployment seen in Q2, a very reactive employment market, but unemployment has since fallen as lockdown measures eased. If we look at Europe, and we've got the UK, France and Germany, unemployment rates have risen much more gradually. There's been furlough schemes throughout the continent that have helped keep those levels marginal, but obviously rates are rising. In Asia Pacific, Australia entered its first recession in nearly 30 years as a result of the pandemic, and unemployment is forecast to rise in a similar pattern to European countries. In China, you can see there was also that similar short, sharp increase in unemployment, but it has since come down, and actually it's forecast to return to pre-pandemic levels by the second quarter of 2021. So a very quick recovery in China. And then very finally, just having a look at Japan, which has been much less severely impacted by the pandemic, and their unemployment rate remains relatively low compared to by international standards. What does this mean for this sort of multifamily sector? Well, it's important because the sector is usually most active at times of economic growth, as employment prospects improve, wage rises, but rent, and that makes rent increases easier for tenants to absorb. But as we just saw, the pandemic has changed this, which means that the ability for rental growth will be more limited in such an environment. However, it's worth noting that higher earning professionals, the target market for many multifamily developers, has to date been less susceptible to disruption to employment. But looking ahead, affordability will be key, and this multifamily sector will need to adapt to this. And diversifying the product offering to meet a greater range of price points might need to be considered. And my final point this afternoon is on multifamily viability. So the economic viability of multifamily compared with the traditional build to sell model has been a barrier in some markets, but public incentives can help improve profitability and increase delivery. And these can be seen in China, Australia, the US in various forms, but they're less common in Europe, although starting to emerge. The economic situation could also present an opportunity. So in times of strong economic growth, the build to sell model is often more profitable, but some developers are now turning their attention to the multifamily sector to diversify and mitigate risk. And finally, it's also worth mentioning that as some sales markets cool, the multifamily market has the opportunity to meet housing needs, and not just in cities. So bringing it back around to what we were talking about before, in suburban and rural locations as well. So that is everything from me. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much indeed, Sophie, for that tour de force, a sort of whiz around the world, as it were. Before we sort of start chatting, I want to remind the audience that there is a Q&A icon down at the bottom of their screens. Please do use that rather than the chat to put your questions to Sophie. I'm sure you'll have quite a few, and we'll deal with them as they start coming through. But in the meantime, I have to say, the working from home sort of issue is certainly the top of my mind at the moment, as I'm suffering from a repetitive strain injury in my right hand, having not paid enough attention to my workspace, I dare say, and that really sort of presents a challenge, doesn't it, to employers. I mean, there are all sorts of ways of looking at that sort of increased desire to work from home. And very interesting, you say, you know, we're not looking at either or. People seem to want both, working from home. And I say working from home rather than working at home, which even sort of raises the question, do they want a third space, a kind of neighborhood workspace, to get away from the kids and the spouse taking up all the broadband, she says with feeling. So I mean, there are multiple things to unpack here, but one thing that strikes me is that employers are actually faced with maybe having to provide, if you like, 3 times the workspace that they used to. If we're no longer willing to commute in, we're going to need a home workstation, a local workstation, perhaps with others, and the main office for all the reasons that you describe.
Yeah, you know, I think that could be a possibility for some companies, and I think I think it will take some time for a lot of these sort of changes to come through. Companies are definitely working out what their strategy is and what people want going forward. I think once we sort of have the vaccine in and we're able to sort of take stock and we're not forced into certain decisions, and it's more about assessing what is right for the company and how things work better. But I do think this has been long enough that the majority of people do agree that things will change, and that hybrid of working from home some of the time or from a local workspace, and in a sort of big central office, you know, everyone agrees there is the place and there is that need for that sort of hub creativity, getting people together, the culture, the education that the younger members of staff get is really critical. At the same time, I think your point about that sort of local office is really interesting and fits into that sort of 15-minute city concept, where if you are able to provide workspaces closer to home, perhaps that's for families that don't have the space to work from home effectively, that's an option for them. So you know, I think we will see that, and I think there will be co-working that at one point, with the sort of hygiene measures everyone was worried about, I think actually that's also going to play an important role going forward. It will become more and more flexible, and I can see things going that way.
Yeah. And linked to that, I suppose, very interesting observation about car usage, because what it seems to me is, if we're not every day going to be sucked in and sort of pushed out of the city in commuting patterns, I mean, there seems to me to be huge challenges then for public transport, how that sort of what the business models that survives on, which is it has the potential to change the shape of cities in itself. But what about this car usage? Do you think that's temporary, as we're all fearful of coughing over each other on the train or tube, or is that going to be, you know, the role of personal transport and perhaps the rise of the electric car, or even autonomous vehicles? How's that going to affect cities, do you think?
Yeah, so I think again this comes down to careful planning, and obviously some of these sort of low traffic neighborhoods that have been introduced during the pandemic have not been without their sort of controversies, and there's been a lot of disruption locally. So I think there's a bit in there about working with local communities to making sure any policy that's put into place is appropriate for the community that they're doing it in. So there's a bit of that, and then there's just, if there's the option not to use a car and you can walk within 15 minutes or cycle if you prefer to cycle, and you can get to all of these local amenities, that need to use a car is going to reduce. So that's where these sort of city layouts and having that convenience near you can have a really big change on things. And I think it's quite, I mentioned Paris and Portland and Melbourne. It's actually quite interesting to think about London, because London grew up as a whole series of different villages, and a lot of the sort of villages have centres already. Now those centres may need some changes, and I didn't really touch on retail in that presentation, but I think there's going to be a lot of spare real estate on high streets coming in the future, and it's about making sure that we think about the right uses for those, so that people don't need to use their cars, they can walk, and if they're not walking, public transport has to bring these neighborhoods together, and then car is that sort of third option for longer journeys if you can't get the train, or if you need to get, if you need to use a car.
Yeah, so there's this really interesting kind of intersectionality between the sustainability issues of cities, car usage, pollution, and so forth, and indeed the demise of retail. And you're suggesting that the repurposing of retail, maybe keeping the active frontages, maybe would be more appropriate towards neighbourhood commercial uses, as it were, to keep people able to walk and cycle and all those good things. So it's almost a virtuous circle that's highly dependent on planners in cities understanding this sort of fine-grained neighbourhood story, I guess.
Definitely, and the other thing as well as sort of commercial sort of office and co-working spaces is residential, because we still have a huge undersupply of housing in the UK, if we're looking at the UK, but also the majority of other global cities around the world. There is still that issue there, so that's the other opportunity to sort of bring in the residential play as well.
I'm going to start bringing in some of the questions, because we've got some really interesting ones coming up, but it seems to me there's a question for me about whether the old 20th century ways of planning around the uses that go on, sort of very narrow use classes in buildings, is actually going to be appropriate for this neighbourhood-based, multifunctional, multifaceted sort of live, work, play, stay, make, bake, visit sort of neighbourhood. Do you have any views on that? And from a global point of view as well, are we going to see changes in planning globally?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, like I said, I think the planning, it's something that they know has got to be looked at, and having multi-use, it's difficult for planners. It will have to change. Like I said, flexibility has got to be key. We've got to build buildings that aren't just set for one use. We've got to be able to have, a market in there at the weekends, if it's a co-working space during the week, or bringing together, just making the most of our real estate, because we are in dense cities. We need to have real estate that works for a number of occasions, so we've got to move out of that thinking. I think globally, like I said, there's quite a different story emerging from Asia to the trends that we've just talked about, that are sort of much more UK, Europe, and North America focused. If you look for China, for example, where you've got a number of mega cities there, they tend to be living in smaller apartments. They're often multi-generational apartments. And that idea that you could be working from home is not something that's being taken up there. Personally, I've been speaking to my colleagues in China, and they've been back at the office for months, absolutely no intention of changing anything there. So it is a very different story as we look around the globe, and of course that'll affect how real estate is done. That said, I think they are interested in the idea of more sort of local neighborhoods in the mega cities as well as the smaller cities.
Well, that comes back to your point about the trends that were already in train pre-COVID, the search for the globally footloose, sort of talented millennial and now younger, I guess, workforce, actually meaning that the quality of urban environment that's on offer, as well as the quality of the workspace itself, was starting to become more important, even in Chinese cities. So we're back to this intersectionality. I suppose maybe Asian cities will start to change for environmental reasons as well, and maybe workplace,
There's been
reasons.
very positive announcements coming from China, South Korea, Japan in terms of their net zero plans. So I think we will be starting to see that come through for them as well.
Yeah. And so on that line, we've got Ruth Ling Wong Holmes here asking, do you think that we will see an increase in quality green space due to the value people have placed on it during lockdown?
Yeah, I do. I think I think it's really important, and I think the appreciation that people have had for parks and being able to access nature has really, really changed during the pandemic. And when that was the only thing we had to go to, it's going to become increasingly important. And as I said, I think that the idea that uh, you can access more of the greenbelt space and give cities and sort of urban dwellers more access to that space will be really important as well as cities continue to grow. It's got to be equitable, and we've got to make sure that everyone has access to this space.
Mm. And so that's a kind of the environmental impacts. And you're kind of implying that this sort of collective social experiment, or sort of almost folk memory of lockdown, might actually permanently change the nature of demand for our homes, for green space and so forth. Does that mean that the demand patterns are going to be different in, say, the US and the UK, where lockdown, and indeed Europe, where lockdown has been much more pronounced than perhaps in other areas, global regions?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think where you've got a city of sort of 25, 30 million people, it'll be different. But the lockdown, I think one of the things that's been really positive for me is that there was a worry that this lockdown and the virus would take environmental issues and sustainability off the agenda. I think if anything, people's time to sort of reconnect with nature and see that has actually, if anything, accelerated it and brought it to people's fore even more, so that there's more concern on the environment. And I think we can see that worldwide as well.
Yeah. So moving on to sort of more economic sort of conditions, Peter Madden asks, how do you see this impacting on city centres, many of which are having a triple whammy? Presumably that means, the demise of retail, now the threat to office space, and all the problems of commuting, I guess. How might they come out of the pandemic? So thinking specifically of the sort of central, the CBD, if you like, how might they come out of the pandemic differently, do you think?
Yeah,
Can they turn into multi-use neighborhoods, for example, I suppose?
well, really interesting point. And I think a lot of this at the moment is um is a point of view rather than having the data on it. Obviously we haven't seen it, but if there are fewer people going in, and if we get to a stage where there might be sort of less office space in city centres, that is still sort of, like I said, prime real estate location, and that just means that we may well see a change of usage, and where these neighborhoods are in, perhaps when we're talking about these sort of 15-minute neighborhoods, we're imagining them all in the outskirts of cities. That needs to happen in the inside of cities as well. So it's got to be across, whether you're looking in the center or looking at the outside of cities. So I think you will see some changes in there. You perhaps see more people living centrally, and perhaps a look at what the retail offering is. But the other point is that cities like London, I'm sure we're all very familiar with. Like I said at the sort of start of the presentation, the theatres, the restaurants, the shopping, the nightlife, that is all still going to be there. So while it's being hit at the moment, that's been some of the most resilient retail. It's been some of the most resilient sort of real estate, full stop. And that attraction, I think, is still going to be there. People still want cities buzz. They still want that environment. Yeah, so a bit of both.
Yes, one of the things I've missed most is just eavesdropping on other people's conversations and people watching. I really look forward to being able to do that. So also we've got two kind of linked questions here from Yuting Chen and James Jennings. So Yuting is interested in how before the influence of COVID, there were trends of new immigration into he says big cities in Europe, but they're actually amongst the smaller cities in Europe, this sort of alternative small city. What other trends have been driving that? And then James also says, he's interested in the growth of second and third tier cities, and those places growing at a particular slow pace or fast pace. What's the trajectory on this? Second tier cities, smaller cities. Where's the growth going to be?
Yeah, so I think, the trend that we were looking at and what I was trying to pull out on that migration data is that we were already seeing as a proportion of existing population, so perhaps unsurprisingly the smaller cities are growing more, but we were already seeing that it was those smaller cities that were seeing that high level of migration, and we were already talking about the trends of lifestyle cities, quality of life over perhaps the bigger mega cities, where if you look at London, for example, it's the international migration that's sort of keeping the population growing. Actually, we've always seen more people, sort of particularly people who'd been living in London for a while, leaving London. And Yolande, I know this is something that you've talked about historically as well. So that sort of trend was always there, and I think this is a good opportunity for smaller lifestyle cities to continue to grow. It will be critical in terms of attracting the right sector, the right investment. So I mentioned tech. Almost every sector is tech now, but if you look at tech as a sector, or sectors like life sciences, which is emerging, and sort of very very popular, a lot of investment going into that at the moment. So it's having that right environment, but making sure that as the city grows, you keep up with the infrastructure, you're able to provide housing. Affordability is obviously a huge driver. So Paris, London, I mentioned, very expensive cities. Often people are going to these smaller lifestyle cities for affordability reasons. If they do not keep building housing for that demand, they will have the same affordability issues that the bigger cities have. So it's making sure that they adapt. I hope
There's
that
a real
answered it.
qualitative shift in. I was thinking about this when I was looking at the investment graph, because it's very simplistic, say, retail investments down and offices and so forth, and beds and sheds holding steady, and of course there's hospitality through the floor. But within those trends, maybe there's a question about offices where, or what kind of offices maybe are being invested. I suspect there are some complex sort of geographical trends going on, but you're saying that basically the fourth industrial revolution, as it were, was already changing cities and enabling people to change their location habits, as it were.
We're seeing an interesting trend of this sort of work from anywhere, where people are either sort of, when they're allowed to, going away and thinking, oh, I'm going for a week's break here. Actually, I'll make that 2 and work for 1 week of it, or spend time. It does massively enable and stop you being tied to one location. So it's a really interesting trend in a world where we were already seeing, like we said, this sort of millennials who are very willing to travel and move to the city or the location with the right opportunity.
Yeah, so it's the end of presenteeism in the office, as it were.
I hope so. I think that's the big change that's come through, and I think this has been a massive social experiment for all of us, and I think that's one thing that it has demonstrated. And there are a number of studies out there showing sort of productivity, which is always very difficult to measure, but that productivity from home can be more effective than in the office. It really depends what task you're doing. So there's that view that you have to be in an office to be doing work, I think, has gone. But like I said, offices are still incredibly important. I feel very passionately, particularly for the sort of education of more junior members and that side of things, that sort of being able to pass on knowledge is very difficult.
It's really brought home just how much of a learning environment the office is. I think, hasn't it? So many people, gosh, there's so many things I could say. What about Brexit, and international migration into London? Can we still expect it to? But rather going down that route, I'll pick up some of the questions. I guess kind of related to that, Nin Ho says, what's your view on potentially increasing social inequalities for people who can't live in the areas with greener spaces, live close to their work, or working from home in bad conditions? Is the post-COVID world going to exaggerate these, I suppose?
Yeah, so I think, and we've spoken about this, Yolanda, I think there's almost a responsibility on companies as well to have a look at what workspaces their employees have if they're not working from an office. So I'm not quite sure if that's what he means. But yes, having that, being able to provide an option that's either local, in a central office, or even providing a space from home, making sure you've got the right equipment if you are going to be working from home, that sort of thing. So I think employees do have that as a responsibility. There's I would hope that the green space, and that needs to be looked at, because it's I think we're very lucky in the UK when we compare ourselves to other cities in terms of the access that we do have to green space. When you look at London, it's actually one of the greenest cities. We have big green outside spaces that obviously anyone can access, so that is a huge positive. Of course there's still sort of inequality and social equity issues there, but I think the neighbourhood issue can help address that, as well as sort of, it often just comes down to, we need more housing, we need more affordable housing, and we need housing that's appropriate for built for the right customer.
Do you think that housing might start to be thought of as more than just, as it were, the unit, and much more about the sort of experience that you have of a total neighbourhood? In other words, are we going to get sort of all the things that enable us to live better, including green space, but also sort of small commercial units and workspaces and so forth as part of the housing package, do you think?
I think when
In
you
anywhere where that's happening? Or?
Well, I mean, when you get developers building big new schemes, you definitely get that integration, and I think that's when it works well. So King's Cross is a great example of somewhere where there's a lot of integration between the residential and a whole different host of residential available, from student all the way up to the sort of the prime property, senior housing, etc., etc. So you've got a whole range of people who are sort of being drawn to live there. You've got the commercial, you've got university, you've got public space, and that's all been brought together. I think developers are thinking about it. They're also thinking much more about the sort of sustainability, and not just sustainability, but the ESG credentials. So the social part is just as important as the environmental part, and creating that community is key.
Mm. And you threw in there the sort of elderly housing.
Yes.
That was one of the, I mean, investment in that sector has turned right down. I mean, there are clear reasons for that. I mean, it's worst hit by COVID, and certainly in the UK. But are the models, the sort of 20th century models of elderly care, if you like, or retirement housing, going to hold, do you think? Or are we going to see the emergence of a new investable sector there?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really interesting sector. I think in the UK, we've got a lot of lessons that can be learnt from abroad. So there are some countries that do this really well. We can look at Australia, New Zealand, the US to a certain extent. They've got models that are working. A much higher proportion of their elderly population will live in homes. Now, there's a whole, I think when you start thinking about ageing populations, you can sort of fall into the trap of just thinking about care homes, but there's a whole sort of housing with care, and there's a whole spectrum of offerings that need to be available to people. Long term, I think it's a huge area that needs investment in. You look at our aging population, and you look across the world, actually, pretty much, and there is a sort of ticking time bomb in terms of the aging population, and we need to be able to have solutions that work for them.
Well, earlier you mentioned multi-generational housing, and that seems to be something I hear increasingly about in terms of in the context of providing housing for the elderly. Not to mention care robots and so forth.
Yes.
But that's a whole new conversation. But have another one there. Okay, so how let's see there's some anonymous questions here which ask about Savills in particular, which I know you're probably not in a position to answer, but there was one question about the residential house prices. I mean, most people expected prices to fall, but something really weird is happening here. That huge bounce back. The basic question is, do you expect it to last, or are the affordability issues going to start to bite? What's your idea? And maybe more, they're asking about UK, but maybe more broadly, are we still in for lots of house price growth going forward?
Yeah, so it is really, I mean, like I said, it's sort of the housing markets was worth it, and well, I felt it was worth that closer examine, because it has been quite extraordinary, the sort of return in activity this year. And I think the short answer is no, that can't continue. Obviously the stamp duty holiday has helped in that, and that's finishing in March. I think that what we have is a robust enough system. I don't think we'll see falls, but your question of growth, it's going to slow right down, and we need to look longer term. If we're looking over the sort of past, so the next 5 years, we need to start thinking about interest rate rises, that sort of thing, and that will sort of start to stretch affordability. If I look globally, there's not many places left where I can see huge levels of growth. If we're looking at cities, if we are looking at any, it's those sort of more livable lifestyle cities that we talked about before, where affordability is less stretched now, and there is sort of more room for house price growth. Yeah, so.
Yes, I've started using, when people speculate about the shape of recovery, V-shaped, U-shaped, Nike whoosh-shaped, square root-shaped, or whatever, I'm increasingly drawn to the idea that it's kind of K-shaped, that there are almost three economies sort of starting from data. And there are some people in jobs that have proved anti-fragile, if you like, have actually thrived under the lockdown and COVID, and others have really suffered. Aviation, for example, being an obvious one. So it almost seems that there's two trajectories, and there's going to be more than one housing market as a result. There are these people who decide that they want more gardens, more space, or whatever, and highly active, but there's a whole load of people who are probably finding themselves in almost unlivable neighborhoods, sort of miserable apartments, who may want to move but just won't be in a position to do so. So yeah, I'm wondering if you are going to be able to forecast average house prices, because there's two completely different markets there. It seems to me. So maybe, yeah, trick question there.
No, it's a really good point, really interesting, and it's so right. People ask for average house price forecasts. It can vary street to street, property type to property type, and yeah, there's huge variation, and it just happens, like we've seen at the moment, people are wanting places with gardens, with outside space in sort of more village, rural locations. Like I said, the decade before that, it was all about urban centres, and as close to the centre as you could get in some cases. So these trends reverse and sort of come in waves and up and down.
Yes, so to use a COVID metaphor, I talk about the city sort of breathing in. We've been used to the urban renaissance where everybody's been sucked into the centre city, as you say, and maybe now cities are breathing out and sort of leaving particles over a much wider area, as it were. Yeah, so I guess that also brings me on to a pet subject, that's sort of going forward. We're in a low interest rate, low inflation, sort of Japanese-like economy. Then it strikes me that when you have no more yield shift, when interest rates have pretty much bottomed out, there's no more automatic sort of asset price growth of any kind, including housing, under that circumstance. So I become very interested in rents, and you talked about rents, and there seem to be signs, certainly in London, that they're falling. Should we be using rents as a much, particularly residential rents, as a much more meaningful indicator of the health of a sector?
I think you need to look at both to have a good understanding. I think that's a really good point. Rents is going to give you gives you a reflection on what people incomes can afford much more readily than the capital values, because you're not reliant on the sort of wealth created in other homes as people move homes and up and down the ladder. It does also give you it's a much more fluid market than buying and selling, so it's gonna give you the changes are going to be sort of shorter and sharper and quicker and more reactive. So if rents and I think some of the data does indicate that sort of centre of London rents have fallen, and that's perhaps not surprising as people think, well, given I could be in lockdown, even now we're being told till end of March. If you're looking to renew your contracts, then you wouldn't pick somewhere that's a one-bed flat in the centre of London. That said, in a year's time, you might feel like you want to go back there. So it's much more reactive. I think it's important to look at both. But yeah, really interesting.
Possible lead
point.
indicator there. Yeah.
Possible, but I think you're more likely to make a reactive choice in the rental market, whereas obviously selling up and buying comes with a lot more costs. It comes with a much bigger life decision. So yeah, I think it's definitely going to depend.
Yeah, I was talking to co-living provider recently. It said that their occupancy rates have been nearly as high as pre-COVID during the lockdown.
Yeah.
And actually, interestingly, I thought lots of interest from older age groups, going back to that sort of elder living. Not everything has to be a care home, as it were, to appeal.
There is actually always an older demographic than you think in co-working. It's not only the early 20s. You've got a lot of, you've got a huge range. It's really interesting. It caters for a whole number of people who need that flexible housing solution, and we need that. We need, like I said, flexibility to me is key going forward. People want, expect, and need flexibility.
So that plays in very well to a question from Mr. Anonymous or Mrs. Anonymous or Ms. Anonymous here, suggesting the top 3 policy levers in the UK that the UK government could use to encourage people back to cities. Presumably you'd put planning flexibility and use flexibility maybe as one of those. Any other ideas?
No, I think really interesting question. I'd probably have to give it a bit more thought, but I definitely agree. I think we've got to look at the planning. I think making more in terms of, like I said, that the sustainability agenda is huge at the moment, and I think making more of the sort of the sustainability benefits of a city and sort of there's almost a knowledge campaign that needs to be run there on understanding that. That's key. I mean, it's not necessarily encouraging people back into cities, but I'd love to see more done in terms of a circular economy being set up. There are obviously plans in place, but I feel like there's so much more that we could do. Again, I know we're very short on time, but like learning from other countries. And to be honest, I'm not sure that we'll need to get people back in. I think people are crying out for entertainment, for that coming back into city centres, for that buzz, for that environment. I don't think we're going to need, and I think huge policy levers to get people back in. And I think we saw that when lockdown did partly lift over the summer, and the number of people out and about was huge. They weren't going back into the offices, but the advice was still against that. So that I think will change.
So that's probably a very good point to end on. I think there's a huge amount of thinking and research and policy to be done here, and that's definitely something that we're going to be looking at. And this point about the global sort of learning from other places, I think, is particularly important. So we'll definitely be following that up at the Bartlett Real Estate Institute. But as you say, we're out of time now. So I just want to say a very big thank you to Sophie for a very interesting and stimulating conversation and presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, same to you, and thank you for having me.
Real pleasure.